Basically, they wanted to see if our people were the missing link, whether there is a difference between Caucasian people, indigenous people, and whether indigenous people were actually closer to the animal kingdom than actual humans. So even in our registers, so when an object comes into the museum, they get written up, they get given a number, and that becomes an accessioned object. So in our accessions register, which deals, we have one that the museum for years have dealt just with collections of remains. It is not only human beings, but it's also animals. And so to collect the skull of a sand person and the skull of a monkey, and they would compare it like that, that is how brutal it was.
Indigenous Rights Radio, because knowledge is power.
Sia au sasuka, sia au sasuka, unike ni mubua, unike ni mubua, unike ni mubua, unike ni mubua, sia au sasuka.
Ancestral remains of 6 Khoi and San individuals exhumed between 1868 and 1924 and held at the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow, Scotland, have been returned to South Africa. The remains were formally repatriated in October 2025, marking a significant event for national healing and the restoration of dignity for the affected communities. The remains, which include those from the Northern and Western Cape, have been returned to the Iziko Museums in Cape Town and will be reburied in the Northern Cape at a later date. For this year's commemoration of the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, we consider the violence of removing one's bones from its grave and what this means for indigenous peoples. In this interview, we hear from Annelize Kotze from Iziko Museums in Cape Town.
So my name is Annelize Kotze. I live in Cape Town. I work at Iziko Museums of South Africa. I am a curator here in our research and exhibitions department, and my title is the Curator of Culture and Identity. But part of my job is also to work on the Human Remains Repatriation Task Team, which is, for myself, connecting communities to not only the objects, but also to the ancestors that are inside of the museum.
Indigenous peoples honor the dead through a variety of rituals that often involve community gatherings, offerings, and distinct burial or ceremonial practices. These can include community feasts, prayers, and sharing memories, as well as placing offerings like tobacco, flowers, or food at grave sites or in sacred fires. Other traditions involve unique disposal methods, like placing bodies in elevated platforms or wrapping them in bark, followed by later retrieval and burial, as seen in some Aboriginal cultures. Annelize will now tell us about the history of the remains of indigenous peoples amongst museums around the world.
So what we do know is when ancestral remains came into museums, it was a business that museums actually did all over the world. And Iziko is very honest about the role that the museum played in the past with collecting and purchasing and also trading with ancestral remains. So the information that we have about them is not a lot. Like, you won't have someone's name, you will have an area. What is, however, known is the person that purchased the remains, or that traded the remains, or that brought them into the museum. And what we had then done is we focused on one particular person, and this person was Percy Ward Laidler. We'll call him the donor in inverted commas. So Laidler worked as a field surgeon, and we found out that not only did he bring remains to Iziko, but he also sold or traded with remains across the globe, and Scotland specifically. And we then contacted them, the Hunterian Museum in Scotland, and said, look, we've done our research. We found out that you guys might possibly have these remains. They confirmed it, and luckily for us, they had also gone through a process of approving their policies regarding remains and repatriations. I went over to go and confirm what they actually have, and we had a curatorial exchange. The curator came here as well from Scotland, which was very interesting because I took him to the Kalahari and I said, go see the faces of the ancestors of the people whose remains you have. And that kickstarted the whole process of us starting to talk with the museums that were forced to approve. Then it's government to government talks, working out how our policy can be practical. And then a lot of logistics later, we finally traveled with a community task team of 10 community members representing the San, the Namas, the Griquas, and the Koranas to go and collect 5 ancestral remains from Scotland and to bring them back to South Africa and where they are now at Iziko.
Funerals are often a time for the community to come together, offering comfort through hugs and shared memories. The celebration extends to a community feast after the burial. Aboriginal people have historically used a range of burial methods, such as placing bodies in fetal positions, sometimes with grave goods like tools or ornaments, and marking the grave with special structures or by cutting bark from trees. The Day of the Dead, or Dia de Muertos, is a celebration that blends pre-Columbian and Catholic traditions, involving the creation of altars with marigold flowers and offerings to help guide the spirits of the deceased. People often celebrate by dressing up in colorful skeleton costumes. It stands to reason that indigenous peoples will be severely affected by the removal of their ancestors from one place to another. Annelize tells us about a time period in history when the 6 individuals from South Africa were moved to Scotland for scientific studies.
The thing is, it wasn't that long ago. It was 1920. So Leidla was a district surgeon in Garis and Makwaland. And at that time, there was a big interest in doing research on especially Khoi and San people. So it was a race-based science. So what they did was they would dig up the remains of especially Khoi and San people to do scientific research to prove that there is a difference between an indigenous person and a Caucasian person. So it wasn't that long ago, but it is over 100 years ago. But if you think about it, you could have known someone from that time, but no names are known. What we do know, however, is the areas that they were collected from, that they were taken from. So the communities that we consulted were from those regions. So sometimes you would even have a location as along the banks of the Orange River. And even how long the Orange River is, that's not very specific. So what we did was, because we knew the type of research that was being done, we consulted with these groups and we asked them to choose people to be part of the process. So we then said, look, this is the sheet, that is the information that we have. And we actually showed them where the ancestral remains were removed. So the areas are there, and that is how we then chose who should be at the meeting. But it was people from further away, because people have an interest in this, and a group of over 100 people became 20 task team members who now go back and report to their communities on decisions that are made.
We asked Annelize about her thoughts around the spiritual significance of the returning of the remains of the 6 indigenous peoples and what she thought it would mean to their descendants and relatives.
When you're in the room with someone that could be related to you, whether it is by blood, by DNA, by area that they're living in. It is a very spiritual process. You cannot go into that room and be unaffected. And a lot of the people that were with us, actually all of them, they have been on this journey with us. So they know why these people were dug up. They know why these people were studied and collected. And they know how important it is that when you are buried, it's a sacred process, it's a sacred space, and that place must be honored. And for that place to have been disturbed, and for the reason that it was disturbed, makes them advocates for their return, for them to find peace, not only as the descendant community, but also for the ancestors who are in boxes in museums all across the globe that were never supposed to be there. So to know that you were part of that process of, just giving the dignity and the humanity back to the remains of your ancestors, where they were not given that dignity and humanity in life or in death, So it was a very spiritual and significant process to know that you are part of that. And you can actually feel it, but the spirituality of it is actually tangible. You can actually feel it. You can feel the peace that comes when you see that, you put them in the aeroplane, you cover the boxes in the South African flag, the plane lands, and you know that your people are there. The processes and that song, the songs that you sing is not just about mourning, it is about joy, it is about, just relief that the journey has come this far and how much we have achieved. So it was celebrations, and it was an amazing experience, and it's only the beginning now.
Museums around the world hold many remains of indigenous peoples, often collected unethically in the past. These remains have been acquired through methods like grave robbing for scientific and colonial purposes. Presently, there are many global efforts by both indigenous communities and institutions to repatriate these human remains and return them to their ancestral lands. Annelize told us about the reburial plans for the 6 individuals.
So at the moment, they are at Iziko. And this was done through consultation with the community, where they said, let them join the others from their area, because in total it's going to be 63 remains that will be reburied. So those that came from Scotland have now been rejoined with those that were all collected by Laidla. And the process going forward is then we will rebury. But the remains will not stay here long. And during this time, communities are welcome to come into the space, because what we have to do as the museum is just to take care of them. We don't allow any studying to be done there. We don't allow any unauthorized people that mean harm. So communities are welcome to come in, to pray in the space, to be in the space, because it is a temporary holding area up until they will finally be reburied.
Sia sia, au sasuka. Sia sia, au sasuka. Unike ni mubua. Unike ni mubua. Unike ni mubua. Unike ni mubua. Sia sia, au sasuka.
For more on the rights of indigenous peoples, visit cs.org and follow Cultural Survival on Facebook and X.